My name is James. I'm in my late 30s, and for most of my adult life, I've been the kind of man people describe with safe words: steady, dependable, low drama. I work with my hands and my head, I pay attention, and I don't raise my voice. If you asked the people around me who I was, they'd probably say I was the calm one, the background support, the guy who keeps things moving without needing credit for it. I've learned that being seen as calm often gets mistaken for being passive. Being private gets confused with being empty. And when you don't perform your emotions loudly, people start to believe you don't have any that matter. This story isn't about revenge. It isn't about rage, or shouting matches, or clever one-liners delivered at the perfect moment. It's about what happens when you stay quiet long enough to hear the truth clearly, and then decide what to do with it. I want to be upfront about that, because a lot of stories like this promise fireworks. This one doesn't. What it promises instead is honesty. The slow kind. The kind that's uncomfortable because it doesn't rush to make you feel better or worse. It just lays things out as they happened. The emotional journey here moves gradually. It starts with small moments that feel easy to dismiss. Little comments, subtle exclusions, a growing sense that the room has shifted slightly but no one else seems to notice. Then comes awareness, not all at once, but in pieces. The realization that the story you thought you were part of might have been written without you in mind. At the center of it all is a single day that should have meant something very specific, a day that's supposed to anchor a marriage, not fracture it. That's when I discovered my wife's second phone on our wedding anniversary. Not in a dramatic way, no confrontation, just a quiet, irreversible understanding settling into place. And with it came a sentence I couldn't unhear once it formed in my head. I wasn't the we they were talking about, not in the plans being made, not in the future being discussed. Not in the shared language that's supposed to hold two people together. What follows after that discovery isn't a collapse. It's a reorientation. A long stretch of silence that looks like endurance from the outside, but is actually decision-making. A period where nothing seems to change, until it does, all at once and without noise. I'm telling this story because I know there are people listening who have felt that quiet displacement. The sense that you're present, useful, even appreciated, but not truly included. And you start to wonder whether noticing that makes you paranoid or finally awake. So before we go any further, I want to ask you something, not to answer out loud, just to sit with. Have you ever been in a room or a relationship where everything sounded normal, but something in you knew you were already being spoken past? To most people, I was easy to define because I didn't demand much definition. I was the husband who always showed up, the one who remembered birthdays without reminders, who fixed things quietly, who stayed calm when plans fell apart. In group settings, I was the listener, the man standing slightly behind his wife at parties, not because she asked me to, but because I didn't feel the need to step forward. People took that as comfort, as stability, as proof that I was satisfied. At work, it was the same pattern. I was trusted with responsibility, not visibility. When something needed to be handled correctly but without noise, it landed on my desk. When praise was handed out, my name was rarely the first spoken. And I accepted that, because competence didn't need applause, or so I told myself. In my marriage, I occupied a similar space. I was the we're good husband, the one my wife could describe to her friends as solid, reliable, safe. When she talked about me, it was always in terms of function, not presence. I handled logistics. I kept things running. I made sure life didn't wobble. What I didn't realize at the time was how easily useful can slide into replaceable when no one thinks you're watching. I wasn't ignored in obvious ways. That's important. There was no cruelty, no shouting, no public disrespect. Instead, there were small assumptions made on my behalf, conversations that continued without checking if I was still part of them, decisions discussed as if I'd naturally agree, because I usually did. When my wife said we, I assumed it meant us, that the word carried weight because of shared history, shared routines, shared nights, falling asleep in the same bed. But slowly, we started to sound rehearsed, like a habit rather than an inclusion. At dinners with friends, she'd tell stories that positioned me as background context. James is great with that stuff. James doesn't mind. James is easygoing. And people would nod, smile at me, and move on. No one asked what I wanted, because I didn't look like someone who needed asking. And the truth is, I helped train them that way. I didn't interrupt. I didn't correct. I didn't demand emotional check-ins or reassurance. I believed that if something mattered, it would naturally surface, that a partnership didn't require constant verification. I thought silence was maturity. Looking back, I can see how my quiet nature became a kind of blank space others felt free to write over. My wife wasn't unkind. She wasn't cold. She laughed with me. She held my hand. She kissed me goodbye in the mornings. But there was a growing efficiency to our interactions. Less curiosity, less pause. I was the man she leaned on, not the man she leaned into. And because nothing was technically wrong, I had no language for what felt off, no justification for discomfort. I told myself this was what long-term partnership looked like once the novelty wore off. Everyone else seemed comfortable with the version of me they had assigned, the dependable constant, the steady background presence, the man who would always be there no matter what. I didn't resent that version of myself, but I didn't realize yet that being underestimated doesn't always look like being dismissed. Sometimes it looks like being fully trusted to stay exactly where you are, while life quietly moves around you. The first moment didn't feel important at the time. That's what makes it dangerous in hindsight. It happened on a Tuesday evening, ordinary enough that I wouldn't have remembered it if it hadn't echoed later. We were in the kitchen, the low hum of the dishwasher filling the gaps between our sentences. I was telling my wife about a scheduling issue at work. Nothing dramatic, just a minor complication I'd already solved. She nodded, half listening, scrolling on her phone. Then she said, almost absent-mindedly, "We should probably start thinking about next year differently." I asked what she meant. She didn't look up when she answered. Just options, flexibility. The word "we" was there, clean, casual, familiar. But something about the way she said it felt misaligned, like she was speaking from a script I hadn't seen. I asked another question. Again, calm, neutral. She waved it off gently, said it wasn't a big deal, that she was just thinking out loud. Then she smiled, leaned over, kissed my cheek, and the moment closed. Nothing was wrong. That's the important part. But later that night, lying in bed, I replayed the exchange. Not obsessively, just once. Enough to notice the small omission. She hadn't asked what I thought next year should look like. It was a cut so small it didn't bleed. A few days later, it happened again. We were at a friend's place for dinner. Someone brought up travel plans, and my wife mentioned a potential trip she'd been talking about. Not with me, she didn't say that, but the sentence curved around my absence in a way that felt practiced. I smiled, took a sip of wine, let the conversation move on. Everyone else did too. That was the pattern. Moments that didn't demand response. Nothing confrontational. Nothing that would justify stopping the room and saying, "Hey, wait." And because nothing was explicitly said, I didn't feel entitled to feel anything about it. The first real cut came the night I realized she had started answering questions about us without looking at me. It wasn't dramatic. Someone asked if we were thinking about moving closer to downtown. She answered quickly, confidently, listing pros and cons like she'd already weighed them. I noticed that I was nodding along to decisions I hadn't participated in. Still, I said nothing. Not because I was afraid, but because I didn't want to overreact. I didn't want to be the man who read too much into harmless phrasing. I trusted my wife. I trusted the life we'd built. And I trusted that if something mattered, she would bring me into it fully. So I treated these moments like noise, background static. But static, if you listen long enough, has a pattern. The cut deepened the day I overheard her on a call. I wasn't eavesdropping, just passing through the hallway when I caught a fragment of a sentence. "Yeah, that's what we're planning." Her voice was light, certain. I paused, not because I was suspicious, but because I was confused. Planning what? When she saw me, she ended the call quickly and smiled like nothing had happened. I didn't ask who she was talking to. I didn't ask what "we" meant. I told myself I didn't need to. That was my mistake. The first small cut isn't betrayal. It's permission. Permission you unknowingly give others to speak for you, to decide your place, to define your inclusion without checking. And once that permission is granted, it rarely gets revoked loudly. It just keeps being used. Looking back, I can see that this was the moment my awareness began. Not as suspicion, but as quiet alertness. A part of me started listening differently, not accusing, just noticing. Because when you feel a cut you can't see, you either dismiss it, or you start paying attention to what's sharp. Once you dismiss the first cut, the next ones become easier to explain away. That's the trap. I didn't wake up one morning feeling disrespected. I woke up feeling adjusted, calibrated to a version of my marriage where small exclusions were normal enough not to question. The language shifted before the behavior did. My wife began using phrases like, "It just makes sense," and "this is easier," when talking about plans. Not our plans, just plans. I noticed I'd stopped asking follow-up questions, not because I didn't care, but because the answers were already moving forward without me. At first, I told myself this was partnership efficiency, two adults dividing mental labor. Not everything needs a committee. But slowly, I realized I was no longer part of the committee at all. There were dinners she attended alone that she used to invite me to. Group chats I wasn't in. Names that came up more frequently, always casually, always without context. When I asked, she'd explain just enough to satisfy the question, then change the subject. Nothing secretive, just selective. And that distinction matters because secrecy feels hostile. Selectivity feels reasonable, polite, easy to excuse. The most unsettling part was how everyone else seemed to accept it. Friends would ask her questions directly about decisions that affected both of us. She'd answer without hesitation. No one turned to me for confirmation. No one noticed I hadn't spoken. And I didn't interrupt, because interrupting would have required admitting that something felt wrong, and I wasn't ready to do that yet. I rationalized my silence with responsibility, with maturity, with the belief that relationships go through quieter seasons. I told myself I was being supportive, but support, I learned, can turn into self-erasure if it's never reciprocated. There was a moment, small, almost forgettable, when a friend joked, "James is so chill, you could tell him anything after the fact and he'd be fine." Everyone laughed, including me. That laugh tasted wrong, but instead of addressing it, I folded it into my identity. This is just who I am, I thought. The man who doesn't need to be consulted. The man who adapts. The man who doesn't complicate things. The danger in that role is that it trains people to believe you don't have limits, just flexibility. And flexibility, when taken for granted, becomes expectation. I noticed how often my wife said, "You don't mind," instead of asking. How she framed decisions as already settled before presenting them. I noticed how rarely she checked my face when speaking. And still, I stayed quiet, because silence had become my default response. And defaults don't feel like choices until you try to change them. Internally, I began running two narratives at once. The first was comforting. This is normal. This is adulthood. This is what stability looks like. The second was quieter, harder to name. Why do I feel like a guest in my own life? That second voice didn't accuse. It didn't shout. It just asked questions and waited. I answered it by working longer hours, by being more helpful, by smoothing things over before they had edges. I thought if I became even more reliable, the distance would correct itself. Instead, it widened, because when people get used to you absorbing everything, they stop checking how heavy it is. The disrespect wasn't loud, it wasn't intentional, but it was cumulative. And the most dangerous part? I was participating in it. Every time I stayed silent to keep the peace. Every time I laughed instead of clarifying. Every time I told myself my feelings were unnecessary because no rule had been broken. By the time I realized I was being treated like an accessory instead of a partner, the behavior had already been normalized. Not just by them, but by me. And once something becomes normal, questioning it feels like overreacting. That's how you lose your footing without ever falling. Every system assigns roles, whether anyone says them out loud or not. I didn't realize mine had already been finalized until I noticed how consistently it was being enforced. I was the reliable constant, the stabilizer, the man whose presence was assumed, not engaged. When something needed to be handled quietly, paperwork, logistics, cleanup, it found its way to me. When something needed enthusiasm, discussion, or vision, it happened elsewhere. I was useful, and because I was useful, I was invisible. The role wasn't cruel. That's what made it hard to resist. There was no villain handing me lines, no moment where someone said, "This is all you're good for." Instead, the expectations formed organically, shaped by my own willingness to accommodate. My wife leaned on me emotionally, but selectively. She came to me for grounding, not exploration, for reassurance, not reflection. I was the place she returned to when things felt uncertain, not the place she expanded from. I didn't question it, because the role came with a kind of quiet honor. Being the steady one feels noble. It feels adult. But there's a difference between stability and stagnation. I noticed how conversations shifted when I entered a room, how topics became practical, logistical, as if my presence signaled a return to reality. Meanwhile, when I wasn't there, things felt freer, lighter, more speculative. That should have told me something. At gatherings, people would hand me tasks without asking. "James, can you handle this?" "James, you're good with details." And I'd do them, efficiently, without complaint. Because refusing would have disrupted the image. And I didn't want to be disruptive. The role had boundaries I wasn't supposed to cross. I wasn't expected to challenge decisions. I wasn't expected to want more. I wasn't expected to change. And the longer I stayed within those expectations, the more uncomfortable it felt to imagine stepping outside them. There was a moment when my wife introduced me to someone new. She smiled and said, "This is James. He keeps everything running." It was meant as praise, but it landed like a summary of my value. Not my curiosity, not my opinions, not my presence, just my function. I remember nodding, shaking hands, playing along. But later, alone, I stared at my reflection longer than usual. I didn't look angry or sad. I looked managed, like someone who had been neatly slotted into a space that didn't quite fit. That's when I realized something unsettling. No one was actively pushing me down. They were just very comfortable with where I stayed. And comfort can be more limiting than control. I thought about how rarely anyone asked what I wanted anymore. How my preferences had become predictable enough not to require consultation. How James will handle it had replaced, "What do you think, James?" The role rewarded me for consistency, not growth. And roles like that don't get renegotiated unless someone disrupts them. But disruption wasn't my instinct. So instead of confronting it, I observed it. I started paying attention to how often my absence went unnoticed, and how often my presence was only acknowledged when something needed doing. I didn't resent my wife, not yet. I didn't blame anyone. I just began to understand the structure I was standing inside. Once you see the role clearly, you have two options: reject it loudly or step out of it quietly. At the time, I didn't know which I would choose. I only knew that staying unaware was no longer possible. The shift didn't happen during an argument. There wasn't a fight or a revelation spoken aloud. No one raised their voice. No doors slammed. It happened on a morning that should have been meaningful for entirely different reasons. It was our wedding anniversary. We had planned something small, intentionally simple. Dinner at home, a bottle of wine we'd been saving. No grand gestures. That had been our style, or at least I believed it was. I woke up early, the way I usually did, made coffee, let the apartment fill with the familiar sounds of routine. I remember thinking how quiet everything felt. Calm, orderly, earned. My wife was still asleep. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand. I wouldn't normally notice. I wasn't the type to check, but it buzzed again. And then again. I glanced over, not with suspicion, but with mild concern. The screen lit up briefly, then went dark. That's when I saw it. A second phone. Not hidden dramatically. Not locked away. Just there, partially tucked under a magazine on her side of the bed. Matte black. Unfamiliar. For a moment, my mind tried to reject the image. It offered explanations. Work phone. Temporary device. A friend's. But explanations require evidence. And the evidence was simple. I didn't know it existed. I stood there longer than I needed to. The coffee maker clicked off. The apartment hummed. I didn't touch the phone. I didn't pick it up. I didn't unlock anything. I didn't need to. The shift wasn't about what was on the phone. It was about what the phone represented. A part of her life that existed comfortably outside of me. I remember sitting down at the kitchen table and realizing my hands were steady. My breathing was normal. There was no adrenaline spike, no panic. Just clarity. This was the moment when all the earlier cuts aligned. The subtle exclusions, the rehearsed we, the plans discussed without me, the conversations that curved around my presence. The phone wasn't the betrayal. It was the confirmation. When my wife woke up, she greeted me like any other morning, kissed my cheek, smiled, said happy anniversary, with warmth that would have been convincing if I hadn't already seen the truth. I smiled back, and that was the real shift. Because something in me had gone quiet, not withdrawn, not numb, just settled. We had breakfast, talked about dinner plans. She mentioned a message she needed to respond to later. I noticed she used they instead of a name. I didn't ask, not because I was afraid of the answer, but because I didn't need it anymore. That was the moment I understood something deeply uncomfortable. I had been included in the marriage, but not in the future she was imagining. Whatever she was talking about in those messages, in those plans, in that second phone, it wasn't me. And the strangest part? There was no urge to confront her immediately. Confrontation would have been loud, emotional. It would have shifted the power back to chaos. Instead, I chose stillness. I spent that day noticing everything. The way she checked her phone when she thought I wasn't looking. The ease with which she switched between devices. The confidence of someone who didn't expect scrutiny. That told me more than any message could. The shift wasn't anger. It was ownership. For the first time, I stopped seeing myself as someone waiting to be included and started seeing myself as someone deciding what to do with the information I now had. I didn't confront her that day. We went to dinner, we toasted, we smiled for the server. And when I looked at her across the table, I didn't feel betrayed. I felt separate. That's when silence stopped being habit and became intention. After the anniversary, nothing externally changed. And that's what made my silence different this time. Before, silence had been my default. A reflex I used to smooth things over, to avoid tension, to preserve an image of stability. Now, silence was deliberate, measured, chosen. I didn't withdraw affection. I didn't become cold or distant. I behaved exactly as I always had. That consistency was important. People expect disruption after discovery. Anger, suspicion, tightened behavior. They look for signs. I gave none. Inside, though, my attention sharpened. I began listening without reacting, watching without commenting, noting patterns without interrupting them. When my wife spoke about plans, I noticed which ones included me and which ones didn't. When she used we, I quietly tracked who benefited from the outcome. And the pattern held. Silence gave me something confrontation never would have: accuracy. I stopped asking questions that would invite rehearsed answers. I stopped offering opinions that would be politely ignored. I let conversations play out fully, trusting that people reveal more when they don't feel challenged. My wife mistook my calm for comfort. She grew more relaxed, less careful. The second phone was no longer hidden at all. It sat on the counter sometimes, on the bedside table, face down but present. She assumed my role protected her from scrutiny. And in a way, it did, because I wasn't trying to catch her. I was trying to understand the structure of the life she was building alongside mine. Silence also changed how others interacted with me. Friends still saw me as the steady one, but something in my demeanor shifted. I was less eager, less responsive, not withdrawn, just no longer filling gaps. And gaps make people talk. I heard more than I ever had before. Casual comments, assumptions stated out loud, stories that didn't quite align. No one realized they were handing me clarity. The most important realization during this period was this: silence is only weakness if it's rooted in fear. Mine wasn't. It was rooted in control. I wasn't waiting for permission to speak. I was choosing the timing of my understanding. There were moments when I could have confronted her, when the phone buzzed late at night, when she stepped into another room to take a call, when she referenced conversations I hadn't been part of. Each time I asked myself a simple question: what would I gain by speaking right now? The answer was always the same: emotion, not resolution. And emotion wasn't what I needed. I needed leverage, not in the manipulative sense, but in the structural one. Knowledge, documentation, options. So I stayed still. People underestimate how much power there is in not rushing to react, in letting the full shape of a situation reveal itself. My wife began making plans more openly, talking about future logistics with confidence, using we in ways that no longer even pretended to include me. And that sentence, the one that had been forming quietly since the anniversary, finally crystallized fully. I wasn't the we they were talking about. Once I accepted that, the confusion disappeared. Silence stopped being heavy. It became light, because silence, when chosen consciously, frees you from the need to explain yourself to people who've already decided where you belong. I wasn't gathering evidence for revenge. I was gathering clarity for exit, and I wasn't in a hurry. What they never noticed was how much I had always been paying attention. Not in a paranoid way, not with suspicion, just the quiet awareness that comes from being the person everyone assumes isn't watching. I had spent years learning systems, how workflows break, how money moves, how people behave when they think nothing is at stake. At work, that skill kept things running. At home, it had made me adaptable. Now it made me precise. Once silence became intentional, I stopped reacting and started documenting. Not obsessively, not dramatically, just consistently. Dates, shifts in routine, conversations that didn't line up. Not to build a case against her, but to understand the shape of the truth. Patterns tell you more than any single act ever will. I noticed how the second phone was used during specific windows of time. Early mornings, late evenings, never midday. I noticed how her mood lifted after certain calls, how she became more decisive, more energized, then slightly distant afterward, as if she had already spent her emotional currency elsewhere. I noticed how plans involving me were logistical, while plans involving others were aspirational. No one ever checked if I was aware of any of this, because no one believed I was capable of seeing it without falling apart. That was the miscalculation. I also began quietly reviewing the practical side of our life together. Not because I wanted to control it, but because I needed to understand my exposure. Finances, accounts, shared responsibilities. Nothing illegal, nothing secretive, just a clear inventory of where things stood. Clarity removes fear. The more I understood the structure, the calmer I felt. At the same time, I started changing small things about myself. Not visibly, not performatively. I stopped overfunctioning, stopped preemptively solving problems that weren't mine. I let silence exist where I used to fill space. People noticed, but they interpreted it as fatigue, not withdrawal. That worked in my favor. What they never noticed was that I had begun reclaiming my attention. Instead of monitoring her behavior emotionally, I treated it analytically. What did her actions suggest about her assumptions? About what she believed was permanent? She believed I would always be there. She believed my steadiness was immovable. She believed my silence meant compliance. Those beliefs shaped her confidence. And confidence makes people careless. I learned more in those weeks than I had in years. Not about her alone, but about how easily people rewrite reality when no one challenges them. Friends began referencing future events in ways that subtly excluded me. Not intentionally, just following her lead. She had already placed herself elsewhere, and the social environment adjusted around that assumption. And still, no one asked me directly. That was the most telling part. I realized then that I had already been emotionally edited out of certain narratives. Not erased, just minimized. I wasn't angry about it. I was done negotiating with versions of myself that existed only to make others comfortable. Preparation doesn't always look like action. Sometimes it looks like patience. I spent time thinking, not about revenge, but about alignment. What kind of life I wanted. What kind of partnership I would accept going forward. What kind of man I intended to be when this chapter closed. That reflection grounded me, because when you know who you are without the relationship loses its leverage over you. I didn't need to expose her publicly. I didn't need dramatic proof. The truth had already revealed itself quietly, and I trusted my ability to act on it when the time came. What they never noticed was that the man they thought was passive had simply been choosing not to interrupt the process. And once a process reaches its natural conclusion, no amount of scrambling can reverse it. I wasn't invisible anymore. I was just preparing to step out of frame. The private reveal didn't come with a rush of adrenaline. There was no moment where my heart pounded or my hands shook. When it finally happened, it felt almost procedural, like confirming a diagnosis you've already accepted. It happened on an afternoon when my wife asked me to pick something up from her car. A small errand. Ordinary. She was in the shower, steam fogging the bathroom mirror, the sound of water steady and oblivious. Her car was parked downstairs. I didn't go looking for anything. I didn't open drawers or search bags. I simply followed the instruction as given. The item she wanted was in the center console. When I opened it, the second phone was there. Unlocked. Not carelessly, confidently. That distinction matters. People who believe they're hiding something check their tracks. People who believe they're safe don't. The screen lit up with notifications. Names I didn't recognize at first. Then patterns I did. Familiar rhythms. Ongoing conversations that didn't pause or disguise themselves. I didn't scroll endlessly. I didn't read every message. I didn't need to. What mattered wasn't the content. It was the context. The tone. The assumption of continuity. The way plans were discussed as ongoing realities, not hypotheticals. There was no language of secrecy, no guilt, no fear of discovery. Just momentum. And that was the reveal. Not infidelity as a singular act, but displacement as a process. I wasn't being betrayed in a dramatic sense. I was being replaced in slow motion. The messages spoke in we statements, in future framing, in shared jokes and mutual understanding that implied emotional investment had already been transferred. I wasn't angry reading them. I was clear. This wasn't a mistake. It wasn't confusion. It wasn't a temporary escape. It was a parallel life, one that assumed my role had already concluded. I locked the phone and put it back exactly where I found it. That detail matters too, because the power in that moment wasn't exposure. It was restraint. I finished the errand, set the item on the counter, went back upstairs. She thanked me, smiled, continued her day. And I understood something fundamental. She believed the reveal would never happen, that the structure she had built was stable enough to hold indefinitely. That belief gave me all the information I needed. I didn't confront her. Confrontation would have forced negotiation, lies, emotional appeals, attempts to reshape the narrative. I didn't want narrative control. I wanted structural control. So I sat with the truth privately. I thought about timelines, about finances, about legal realities, about the emotional cost of staying versus leaving. And for the first time, I didn't ask what she would feel if I acted. I asked what I would respect myself for. That question answered everything. The reveal didn't make me reckless. It made me precise. I began separating emotionally before anything changed externally. I stopped imagining explanations, stopped preparing speeches in my head, because speeches are for people who still want to be understood. I didn't. I wanted alignment between reality and action. The clarity was almost peaceful. That night, we sat on the couch together. She leaned against me, talked about plans that extended months into the future. She said we again, and this time I heard it clearly, not as inclusion, but as habit. The reveal had stripped the word of its power, because now I knew exactly who it didn't include. And once you see that clearly, pretending becomes impossible. The reveal wasn't the end of something. It was the beginning of choosing how it would end, quietly, cleanly, on my terms. There's a moment after clarity settles in where emotion tries one last time to negotiate. Not loudly, not desperately, just a soft pull toward familiarity. I felt it in the days after the reveal, not doubt about what was happening, but temptation to delay, to wait for a better moment, a cleaner justification, something undeniable enough to make the decision feel inevitable instead of chosen. But inevitability is comforting. Choice is heavier. The decision point wasn't about whether my wife had crossed a line. That was already clear. It was about what kind of ending I was willing to live with. I had options. I could confront her immediately, lay the phone on the table, ask for explanations, demand truth. That path would have been loud, emotional, and full of negotiations I didn't want to participate in. I could stay silent indefinitely, accept the parallel life as the cost of stability, continue being useful while quietly shrinking. Or I could do something irreversible, not impulsive, not cruel, just final. I chose the third option, not because it was dramatic, but because it was honest. I realized that confrontation would center her emotions, not mine. Her regret, her justifications, her fear of consequences. And I was done organizing my life around her internal state. The irreversible choice wasn't about punishment. It was about reclaiming authorship. I decided I would leave, but only after everything was aligned, legally, financially, emotionally. Not in secret, not dishonestly, just without announcement. I didn't need her permission to exit a future I hadn't been invited into. That decision brought an unexpected calm, not relief, resolve. Because once you choose direction, the noise quiets down. I stopped asking myself why she did it. That question leads nowhere productive. People rarely betray their partners without first betraying the truth internally. Instead, I asked how I would move forward without bitterness. That mattered to me. I didn't want to become someone defined by this ending. I didn't want to carry her choices into the next version of my life. So I planned carefully. I thought about what needed to be disentangled, what conversations would be necessary, and which ones wouldn't. I accepted that she might be shocked, hurt, angry, but I didn't owe her emotional cushioning at the cost of my own clarity. The most difficult part of the decision wasn't leaving. It was accepting that the version of us I had been loyal to no longer existed. Loyalty to something imaginary isn't virtue, it's delay. Once I understood that, the guilt dissolved. I wasn't abandoning her. I was withdrawing from a role she had already reassigned. The decision point isn't dramatic from the outside. There's no soundtrack, no sudden movement. It's just a quiet internal sentence spoken clearly for the first time. I will not stay where I am not chosen. After that, everything became procedural. And procedure, when guided by self-respect, is powerful. I didn't rush. I didn't warn. I simply began moving in the direction I had chosen, step by step, without needing validation. Because the moment you decide to leave quietly, the story stops being about betrayal and starts being about alignment. Once the decision was made, my life entered a phase that looked completely unchanged from the outside. That was intentional. I didn't pack bags. I didn't withdraw affection. I didn't hint. I moved the way I always had. Steady, predictable, invisible. Silence at this stage wasn't avoidance. It was execution. I began with structure. Quiet, boring, necessary structure. I reviewed documents we shared. Not obsessively, not suspiciously, just thoroughly. I noted dates, obligations, names. I made copies of what mattered and left everything else untouched. There was no rush, no drama, just accuracy. At work, I adjusted my schedule slightly. Nothing noticeable. Just enough flexibility to give myself room. I took on a short-term project that required focus and independence, something that anchored my attention outside the marriage. That mattered more than I expected. Emotionally, I stopped leaning. I didn't seek reassurance. I didn't initiate conversations about the future. When my wife spoke about plans, I listened politely and asked neutral questions that clarified logistics without investing emotionally. She interpreted this as agreement. I let her, because agreement and commitment are not the same thing. I opened an account in my own name. Nothing extravagant, just a place where my income could land cleanly when the time came. I didn't drain anything. I didn't hide money. I prepared an exit, not an escape. That distinction kept me grounded. At home, routines continued. Dinners, evenings, casual intimacy. From the outside, we looked fine. Better than fine, probably. There's a strange ease that comes when someone believes nothing is wrong. People stop checking. My wife became more confident, more relaxed. She talked freely about things that once might have been guarded. I listened without reacting. She had no idea that each assumption of permanence made my departure cleaner. Silence has a way of amplifying other people's certainty. I noticed how often she referenced timelines that no longer included me meaningfully. By next summer, later this year. Always spoken as if I would simply adapt. I didn't correct her. I also didn't internalize it, because my future had already shifted. Moving in silence isn't about deception. It's about refusing to negotiate your exit with someone who already negotiated your absence without you. I prepared emotionally, too. I stopped imagining her reaction, stopped anticipating explanations. I reminded myself daily, you don't owe clarity to someone who withheld it from you. That mantra wasn't bitter, it was stabilizing. There were moments when the old version of me tried to surface, the one who would sit down and say, we need to talk. But talk requires mutual presence, and I wasn't present in her version of the future, so I stayed quiet. Friends continued inviting us to things, sometimes together, sometimes just her. I declined politely when I needed space, accepted when it made sense. No pattern, no signals. I didn't want witnesses. I wanted resolution. What surprised me most during this period was how little emotional turbulence I felt. Not numbness, clarity. The noise had already happened earlier. The confusion, the self-doubt, the internal negotiations. Now there was only motion. And motion, when aligned, feels calm. Moving in silence taught me something I'll carry forward. The loudest transformations often happen where no one is looking. People mistake stillness for stagnation. They don't realize it can also mean departure. By the time anyone noticed something was off, the shift would already be irreversible. And I was okay with that, because some endings don't need announcements. They need precision. The consequences didn't arrive all at once. They never do when you leave quietly. They arrive as absences, as friction where there used to be ease, as confusion that no one can quite name. At first, it showed up in small things. A bill my wife assumed I'd already handled, but hadn't. A plan that stalled because I didn't step in to coordinate. A favor she casually promised someone, confident I'd make it work. I didn't correct her. I didn't rush to fill the gap. I simply let the system run without my silent labor. That's when people begin to feel loss. Not emotionally, but structurally. She mentioned it one evening, half laughing. I feel like things are slipping lately. I don't know why. I nodded, listened, said nothing that would soothe the discomfort. Not cruelly, just honestly. Because the truth was simple. Things weren't slipping. They were returning to their actual state, unsupported. The more I stepped back internally, the more visible my absence became externally. Not in dramatic ways, in inconveniences, delays, missed details. The kind of things that only become noticeable when the person who used to absorb them stops. My wife grew slightly agitated, not with me, but with the environment. She complained about stress, about how much she had on her plate, about how people were letting her down. I noticed she never framed it as we're overwhelmed anymore. It was always I am. Friends began asking questions too. Is everything okay with you two? You seem quieter lately. I smiled, gave neutral answers, said work was busy, that life goes through phases. No one pushed, because from the outside, nothing was wrong enough to justify concern. That's the cost of quiet exits. People don't know how to respond until it's already too late. The real consequences began when my wife tried to lean in emotionally and found less resistance than she expected. She reached for reassurance I no longer offered automatically, asked questions she hadn't asked in months, tested the ground with vulnerability. I responded kindly, but without urgency, without the reflex to repair. That confused her. She was used to my steadiness acting as a counterweight to her uncertainty. Without it, she felt exposed, not because I was withholding, but because I was no longer compensating. The imbalance surfaced slowly. She became more anxious, more restless, checked her phone more often, spoke faster, and for the first time, she noticed the silence. Are you okay? She asked one night, searching my face. Yes, I said truthfully. That answer unsettled her more than concern ever would have, because concern invites fixing. Calm invites questions. The consequences weren't punishment. I wasn't trying to teach a lesson. I was simply no longer participating in a version of the relationship that depended on my invisibility. And without that foundation, everything shifted. She began recalibrating, without understanding why. Trying to restore a balance she hadn't realized was artificial. People always notice when you stop giving what they assumed was endless. They don't call it loss. They call it confusion. And confusion, when unaddressed, turns into panic. But panic only comes when the truth is already too close to ignore. Panic doesn't announce itself dramatically at first. It arrives disguised as effort. My wife began trying again, not in obvious ways, not with apologies or confessions, but with attention, sudden interest, questions she hadn't asked in a long time, small gestures meant to reestablish connection. She cooked dinner one night without mentioning it, lit a candle, poured wine, smiled like this was spontaneous instead of strategic. I thanked her, sat with her, ate, and felt nothing shift. That's when she realized something was wrong. People believe relationships break during conflict. They don't. They break when one person stops trying to be understood. She asked if we were okay. I said, we're functioning. That answer landed harder than anger ever could have. Because functioning isn't intimacy, it's maintenance. She began talking more, filling silence the way I used to, explaining herself without being asked, mentioning stress, work, pressure, loneliness. None of it was false, but it was late. Fixing something requires presence before withdrawal, not after. I listened without interrupting, without reassuring, without correcting. That absence of resistance forced her to confront something she hadn't expected. I wasn't fighting to keep her. She tried nostalgia next, brought up memories, inside jokes, trips we'd taken, a curated reminder of who we used to be. I smiled politely, but nostalgia only works when both people are standing in the same present. I wasn't. Then came frustration. "You're being distant," she said one night. "I don't know where you are anymore." I didn't argue, because she was right, but not in the way she thought. I wasn't distant. I was already gone, internally, structurally, decisively. She asked if there was someone else. I shook my head. "No," I said, "there isn't." That confused her more than any accusation would have, because it meant this wasn't competition. It was conclusion. She tried one last approach, urgency. "We need to talk about the future," she said. "Really talk." I looked at her then, not with anger, not with sadness, but with clarity. And for the first time, I saw fear in her eyes. Not fear of losing me emotionally. Fear of losing the stability she had assumed was permanent. That distinction mattered, because panic rooted in loss of comfort doesn't rebuild trust. It just tries to restore structure. And structure was the one thing I had already dismantled internally. By the time she realized something fundamental had shifted, there was nothing left to negotiate. No misunderstanding to clarify. No argument to resolve. She hadn't noticed my absence while it was happening. Only the consequences of it. And consequences don't respond to apologies. They respond to timing. And the timing was gone. The confrontation didn't look like what people imagine. There was no shouting, no accusations thrown across the room, no dramatic reveal where I laid evidence on the table like a prosecutor. It happened on a quiet evening, after dinner, when the apartment felt unusually still. She had been restless all day, trying, failing, circling something she couldn't name. I waited until the dishes were done, not as a tactic, as a courtesy. Then I said her name. She looked up immediately, alert, ready, like someone who had been bracing for impact. "We should talk," I said. She nodded too quickly, sat straighter, already preparing her defense. I didn't sit across from her. I sat beside her. Same couch, same distance we'd shared for years. "I want to be clear," I said calmly. "This isn't an argument." That confused her. Arguments have rules, turns, volume, emotion. This had none. I told her I knew about the second phone. I didn't describe it, didn't explain how, didn't list what I'd seen, just stated it as fact. She froze, not dramatically, but completely, like a system that had lost power. For a moment, she didn't speak. Then she started explaining. Not confessing, explaining. Context, stress, timing, loneliness. How it wasn't what it looked like. How it didn't mean what I thought. I listened without interruption, not because I needed the information, but because I wanted her to finish speaking without the illusion that I might be persuaded. When she stopped, I waited a few seconds. Silence makes truth echo. Then I said the only sentence that mattered. "I wasn't the we you were talking about." Her face changed, not with guilt, but with recognition. Because that sentence wasn't an accusation. It was a diagnosis. She reached for my hand. I let her, but I didn't squeeze back. That's when she understood this wasn't about fixing something. It was about acknowledging what had already ended. "I didn't mean to push you out," she said quietly. "I know," I replied, and I meant it. Intent wasn't the issue. Outcome was. I told her I was leaving. Not immediately, not dramatically, just factually. I explained that I had already made arrangements, that I wasn't angry, that I wasn't trying to punish her. I was simply choosing not to remain in a relationship where my presence had become optional. She cried then, softly, privately. I didn't move away, but I didn't move closer either, because comfort in that moment would have blurred the truth. She asked if there was anything she could do. I thought carefully before answering. "No," I said, not now. That wasn't cruelty. That was respect for reality. The confrontation ended without closure in the way people expect. No forgiveness ceremony. No explosive ending. Just acknowledgement. Two people sitting with the understanding that something had been slowly dismantled, and that the final piece had already fallen. I stood up. Said I'd sleep in the other room that night. She nodded. Didn't follow. Some endings don't need agreement. They just need to be seen clearly. I used to think identity was something you protected. Now I understand it's something you return to. In the weeks after I left, people expected me to unravel. Friends checked in cautiously. Family asked gentle questions. Everyone seemed prepared for anger, bitterness, collapse. None of it came. What they didn't understand was that I had already done the hardest part alone, quietly, long before anything changed on the surface. When you grieve the truth while still inside the situation, the exit feels less like loss and more like release. I moved into a smaller place. Temporary at first. Clean lines, minimal furniture, silence that belonged to me. The first night there, I slept deeper than I had in years. Not because I was free of responsibility, but because I was finally aligned with myself. I didn't tell people the full story, not because I was protecting her and not because I was ashamed. I simply didn't need witnesses to validate my decision. That was new. I noticed how my body changed before my emotions did. My shoulders relaxed, my breathing slowed. I stopped scanning rooms unconsciously. I stopped bracing for conversations that required me to be smaller. At work, something subtle shifted too. I spoke when it mattered. I declined things that weren't mine to carry. People noticed, not with resistance, but with recalibration. Roles adjust when you do. I wasn't louder. I wasn't colder. I was clearer. And clarity has weight. I thought often about the man I had been, the one who believed endurance was virtue, that staying quiet was the same as being strong. I don't judge him. He did what he knew how to do with the information he had. But I no longer confuse silence with absence. Silence is powerful when it's chosen, destructive when it's inherited. I didn't become cynical about love. That surprised me. I didn't close off. I didn't harden. If anything, I became more precise about what intimacy requires. Presence, mutual inclusion, curiosity that goes both ways. I learned that being low maintenance is only admirable when it doesn't cost you your voice. And that quiet dominance isn't about control over others. It's about authorship over yourself. I still wear the same watch, still move through the world calmly, still don't raise my voice. But the difference now is this. When I'm in a room, I know exactly why I'm there. And when I'm not included, I don't negotiate for space. I leave. That's not bitterness. That's boundaries. Who I am now isn't defined by what I endured, or what I uncovered, or even what I chose to walk away from. It's defined by what I no longer accept. And that's a kind of strength no one can take from you. There's a version of this story that could have ended differently. One where I confronted earlier. One where things exploded loudly. One where blame was assigned cleanly and pain was made visible enough to feel justified. But that version wouldn't have been truer. The truth is quieter than we like to admit. People don't usually leave because of a single betrayal. They leave because of accumulated absence. Small, normalized moments where they stop being included and start being assumed. That's the real fracture. The second phone wasn't the core of the story. It was the symbol. A physical object that revealed an emotional truth that had been forming long before I saw it. And the most important lesson I took from all of this wasn't about her behavior. It was about mine. I learned that being calm doesn't mean being invisible. That loyalty isn't measured by how much you tolerate, but by how honestly you stay aligned with yourself. That silence can be wisdom or self-erasure, depending on why you're choosing it. For a long time, I believed that being easy to be with meant asking for less, needing less, taking up less space. What I didn't realize was that this can teach people to treat your presence as optional. And optional love always finds a replacement. Quiet dominance isn't about walking away to prove a point. It's about recognizing when your role has been reduced and refusing to perform it any longer. No rage, no humiliation, no public spectacle. Just a clear decision made in private and honored consistently. If there's anything I hope stays with you after hearing this, it's this. Pay attention to how often you're included without asking. Notice when we starts being used in ways that don't involve you. And trust the discomfort that doesn't come with obvious evidence, because it's usually pointing to something structural, not emotional. You don't need proof to respect yourself. You don't need permission to leave a future that doesn't include you. And you don't need to explain your clarity to people who benefited from your silence. So I'll end with a question, not to provoke, not to judge, just to open space for reflection. Have you ever realized too late that you were being counted on, but no longer being counted in? If so, I'd like to hear how you handled it.
Cảm ơn các bạn vì đã theo dõi đến cuối. Đừng quên ấn like, share và bật chuông để không bỏ lỡ những video mới nhất nhé. Hẹn gặp lại.